Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today's guest is George Jacob, President and CEO of the San Francisco Bay Ecotarium. Thanks for joining us, George, and a reminder to our webcast guests that you can ask questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to cover those topics during the show. So, George, it's so great to see you. Talk a little bit about your work at the Bay Ecotarium and how you have morphed the organization over the last year since you came on board.
Yeah, so this is the fourth year at the Bay Ecotarium, which is an amalgam of 6 institutions under one nonprofit umbrella with a common mission of conserving and protecting the San Francisco Bay and with a focus towards earth justice, climate justice, environmental conservation, and education. So the BASE Institute, which is the Bay Institute, has been in existence now for 40 years, so 4 decades of environmental policy. And the Aquarium of the Bay, which is affiliated with the Smithsonian, accredited by the AZA, has been around now for 24 years. So we function out of 3 or 4 different buildings in the city and one in Sausalito. And we have an incredible team of biologists, scientists, divers, facilities, marketing, communications, design. It has moved at a certain pace, and now we feel that it's time for it to rejuvenate itself. And we unveiled our vision for its future in October of 2018, and the future looks good. It is a fairly large and comprehensive climate and ocean conservation living museum with a bigger aquarium, situated in about 3.5 acres of landscaped zone, the green zone on the Embarcadero.
One of the things that I really was looking forward to in this show is that you and I got to know each other years ago when we were scanning the horizons for very interesting people, and you were in a totally different environment. You're not an ecologist, you're not a scientist, you are a designer, you are an artist, you are a museum professional. You have developed some very renowned exhibitions throughout the world and in the United States. You are not the usual suspect for running this type of an institution. Just sketch out very briefly your career arc and sort of your attributes as a leader. And then let's talk about the actual change that has been wrought at the Bay Ecotarium, the whole rebranding piece, the whole conceptualization piece, but also in very recent times during this COVID pandemic, how you and your team have strengthened the institution even in these very dire times. But let's start a little bit just to give people a sense of George Jacob.
I became a science museum director at 25, and that was some 30 years ago. And the project was interesting because it was not an established institution. It was under construction. So as every phase of the construction ended, I started leading it, and eventually led the entire organization, which was fairly large, a 232,000 square feet facility on a 9-acre site. And over the years since then, I've straddled both the commercial side of the museum design build industry and also the nonprofit side of leading museums, establishing museums. And I've been fortunate to have worked on over 108 assignments in 11 countries. And that gave me a depth and breadth of perspective, which is a bit unusual for a person in the museum field. And that also gives you a sense of a different business acumen on how to manage money, material, and manpower, quite unlike what traditional museums do with their business models. And that has given it that nimbleness and the flexibility of dealing with challenges like COVID.
And you come at this not as a scientist, although you respect scientists and you've worked very closely with scientists. You come at this as an exhibition designer, as an artist, and as somebody who is providing experiences for individuals. So what I find to be very interesting is when you look at science museums, when you look at museums that are really about taking what is going on in nature and making it accessible, so often you either get administrators on the one hand who are adept at the financial management piece, collaborating with scientists, or you can also get scientists who have risen to this level of management. You actually come at it from the visitor experience, from the side of who was walking in the door and trying to enrich that experience, and your collaborations are in turn rich with others who have knowledge that you don't possess.
So my academic background is museology, with a focus on science museums and subsequently management. But I do look at institutions from a visitor experience point of view. I do look at them from a point of view of a faster turnaround of relevant content. I'm acutely conscious of the very slow curatorial process that happens at many institutions. And by the time an idea becomes an actual exhibit experience, it is already there's a phase lag there in terms of relevance. And I've always been interested in reducing that gap. One of the last museum projects that I worked on was built in record time. It's the fastest museum built in Canadian history. 11 months for construction and 32 weeks for everything on the inside of the museum, the full exhibit experience, which is unheard of. In 32 weeks, you have to finish all stages of interpretive planning, exhibition planning, production, installation, commissioning, and testing, in addition to all the allied services that go with a full-fledged museum, including retail, cafe, trained education staff, auditorium, theater, the whole spectrum. So that pace of work, set a new bar for possibilities and potential.
In terms of what you found when you came to what then was called Bay.org, just describe your first day on the job, after you accepted the role, walking into the facility, looking at the finances. I know you had a very dedicated staff, but they had a lot of challenges when it came to sort of keeping the living exhibitions, the animals alive. Just describe what you found, and then let's talk about the measures that you took over the subsequent 4 years.
So the organization, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, is about 24 years old, and at that time it was about 21 years old. It had so the aquarium is about 56,000 square feet. It holds about 750,000 gallons of salt water in its tunnels, with about 24,000 animals, 186 species. So it's a fair-sized facility located in a beautiful location on Pier 39, which the Embarcadero gets 15 million tourists a year. We get a sliver of that into the aquarium. And we also operate the Sea Lion Center, which is about 250 yards from the aquarium. The aquarium is a gem. It has been serving the communities for a fairly long time, and is committed to providing free education programs to a lot of children each year. And so its mission is, truly important and vital for this community. All the species of animals, most of them we have in our collections, are from the San Francisco Bay. And that provides a lens into the health of the bay and some of the challenges faced by this fragile ecosystem that supports biodiversity in the San Francisco Bay. So from that perspective, it is a beautiful facility located in a high footfall area, high traffic area. However, because of the age of the facility, it had deferred maintenance issues, and it had some other challenges with navigating galleries, linear flow. The exhibits are a little dated, and they continue to be dated. So those were some of the areas where we thought we should do an audit. And subsequent to that audit, we decided to create a master plan to address some of the gaps there, and think outside the box, not just in terms of fixing a short-term problem with an exhibit or two, but in terms of looking at the potential of what is happening in the world today and how we can leverage the bigger challenges of climate, environmental justice, earth justice, into one cohesive dialogue where you look at problems that the carbon emissions and pollution and ocean acidification and sea level rise pose on one hand, And on the other hand, look at solutions which are either policy-based or individual action-based, or based on new technologies, both at the nano level and at the prototyping levels. And a lot of it is unfolding right here in the 50 to 100-mile radius in the Bay Area, which is, the Silicon Valley attracts the best of the best minds. And, and there have been many inventions and innovations here that have changed the world forever.
One of the things that I think is so fascinating is if you look at the old idea of the exposition, the expo, or the World's Fair, in which people come to experience what is new and to get their creative juices going. You have actually taken this place, and you've seen the potential of San Francisco as a tourist magnet, increasing the magnetism by evolving the institution to attract people, to then have a dialogue on environmental conservation, on global warming, on climate change, on the lived environment in which we in urban settings are stewarding. And you're then sending people out to continue those discussions within their communities and adapting those lessons to their environments. In terms of these last couple of months, talk about how you've shifted some of the realities here as you've had to shut down partially the institution during the COVID time, where you had no earned income at all, how you have preserved the health of the animals, and how you have changed the operating realities, positioning yourself for a reopening.
So these were truly challenging times. Many institutions have not seen this sort of crisis at a national and international level ever. And it came swiftly, it came without warning. And on 16th of March, we had a public health advisory to shelter in place. And once that reality sunk in, we had to quickly calibrate the impact of what that really means. And at that time, we didn't know that the shelter in place would last for 2 weeks or 10 days or 5 months. So, creating those scenarios as to the impact that we'll have on a shut aquarium with zero revenue and no endowment, that became, priority number one. Furloughing and laying off some of our dedicated staff was a very hard decision. And, but we absolutely had no choice, because at that time, we didn't even know that payroll protection plan was going to be a reality within 4 weeks of the pandemic sheltering the entire country down. So in those uncertain times, we had to take some tough decisions. We moved on one hand very quickly to reduce our staff strength. On the other hand, we moved our request for federal assistance within days. We worked with our financial institutions to make sure that we had certain deferments in place for rent waivers and postponing some of our accounts payable. So we had to get very nimble with our finances. That was number one. Number two, we figured out a way to maintain a core staff, because we have live animals. Unlike most museums where collections don't involve living creatures, we have that additional challenge of taking care of the animals, making sure that we have a supply chain for their food, and making sure that the core team is in place and their payroll is protected, because aquarium is a 24/7 operation.
Right.
So the animals are there 24/7. So we have to account for 3 shifts of operations. So that's it's a very expensive proposition to run this complex organization.
Which means electricity, it means
Yes.
heating, it means...
Exactly. I mean, all of those things, you have to have utilities, you have to have your filtration systems, life support systems, you have to have divers to feed the sharks and other animals. There are things happening behind the scenes. One of our bat rays gave birth to 3 pups in the middle of the crisis. So, there were a number of things. Nature doesn't stop. So, we had to make sure that we had adequate resources and backup plans to ensure that the core function and our collections mandate meets the high standards of the AZA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So that set of activities was shielded from the larger crises. Then we had to figure out, how we would take care of our emergency needs. And we were fortunate to have raised some emergency funding, which happened fairly quickly, within weeks. The process was an unheard of in terms of its pace. In 12 days, we were able to raise some emergency funds. And close to the heels of that, we received some federal assistance. So that was a bit of a reprieve for us. We could breathe a little easy. And then on the footsteps of that, we've been able to restructure our financial model so that we have a plan which extends for over 2 decades beyond this point.
So you not only been able to retire a part of your debt during this crisis, you've been able to retain operations and retain the health of the animals, and you are also trying to position yourself for a reopening. What will the reopening look like?
So we adopted a 2-pronged strategy. On one hand, we hunkered down to create a lot of online content. So this is not just OtterCams and some e-learning modules. Several of them are already on our web portal. But what we are planning to do is generate virtual gallery experiences on different topics. So we are looking at a gallery platform which would provide content very differently from say a webcam or a webcam-based classroom-like setting. So we're kind of looking at some possibilities beyond, and we are fairly ahead of the curve, and we are looking at a pilot prototype launch in a matter of months. So that's been a process where we've invested a lot of intellectual capital. And we've been working with 1 or 2 of our advisors from the Silicon Valley to make sure that we launch something which is interesting, innovative, upgradable, and so on. So that is happening on one side. On the other side, we put some protocols in place for a reopening. We consulted our colleagues at the Association of Zoos and Aquariums around the country. We looked at some of the aquariums that opened back in May. And as you know, that pretty much all aquariums in California have opened, with the exception of us, and we're hoping that it should happen in the next week or so. We're looking forward to it. But we have put together a fairly comprehensive reopening plan with safety precautions, distancing precautions, and not just for guests, but also for our own staff. And there's a training process that's being worked on so that our staff is well trained on some of those protocols that we have put in place. And we'll be watching the visitor trends. We'll be learning from some of our colleagues of other aquariums where things have been successful. And we floated multiple surveys and collected some data ahead of the curve. And all that is part of a comprehensive reopening plan that we've submitted to both the state and the city.
And then as you gain traction, you are planning to kick off a capital campaign for the new Bay Ecotarium facility that you've been working on for these last years. A magnificent new marquee facility to drive forward this discussion about conservation and climate and so on. Talk about your plans, which are emerging right now. It's not nothing is set in stone. How can it be in this crazy COVID time? But if you could just give us a bit of a preview of how you're thinking.
It's a 2-step process. The first step is we are going to provide an executive summary, if you will, of this larger project through a smaller traveling exhibit with a very strong virtual component. So it's a pilot that we intend to launch ahead of the curve so that people get a glimpse of shape of things to come. So it's a 1,000 square foot, 1,500 square foot exhibit with a very strong virtual component. That'll be the first phase of showcasing, what is coming down the pipeline. The bigger project, of course, we have an event that is a hybrid event that's being planned for November 18th. Log on to our website. It's called the Blue Marble Benefit. And that gives you a sense of the scale of what we are thinking and what we are planning. The base facility that's a transformation of the aquarium is 3 times the size of the current facility. And it has a very, at the very core, it has a enhanced aquarium experience. But on the periphery, it has this focus on climate and environmental justice through a theatrical immersion and storytelling that uses Native American voices for environmental stewardship and indigenous perspectives, especially in post-colonial societies. So there is that component, and then there is a applied technology and innovation section where you actually get to test and see and get a feel for new technologies that are addressing bigger issues like carbon sequestration or microplastics or high decibel level ocean pollution with noise and so on and so forth. So it's a plethora of very interesting components. There's also a layering of biomimetics, both on the building. So the building has some intelligent functions that have never been deployed in the United States before. So from that perspective, it's a very sophisticated building that has a biofacade, biomimetic facade. So I think all of those elements would be inspirational and aspirational for the next generation. In terms of its global spread, we are going to use a significant amount of artificial intelligence on the project, where physical components situated around the world as an ecosystem of satellite citizen science pods, if you will, where there would be active curation and content sharing that has not been tried before by conventional museums.
Well, one of the things that I find so fascinating about your concept is this idea of the museum as simply the smallest part of a bullseye that encompasses the entire planet. You have in the museum itself a series of experiences and knowledge that is shared about how to address these different issues. And then from that, you go out, you basically widen your bullseye mark. You encompass the bay, you encompass the underwater pieces of the bay, the living organisms, the shores around the bay, the city of San Francisco itself. And then you keep going further and further and further afield. You go to the salt marshes down at the South Bay that are being recovered. You are going into the ocean and how the ocean feeds the bay. And then you go out to sensors scattered throughout the world and collecting information, and you're providing real-time experiences. And then in addition to all that, you have this audience coming into San Francisco in normal years where people are going to come in, experience this facility, go back and take that knowledge. I mean, it's just such a wonderful concept of international environmental diplomacy, yet a local experience that can inform visitors physically in San Francisco or virtually in San Francisco through the web. It's just a wonderful concept.
Thank you. Because this is such a interdependent problem and it has interdependent solutions, there are conferences and conventions and symposiums on this very complex topic of climate and environment. And you find that there are, dozens of them each year, but there is no comprehensive place where you can actually have an experiential sense of scenario building, if you will, and a sense of the history of human ingenuity in terms of finding solutions, whether it's blue economy or green economy or some of the other solutions. A unit like this is replicable in different parts of the world, and they have a collective responsibility of staying interconnected, because this problem is a continuing problem. It's not a delta, it's a sigma. So you have to have that sense of appreciating the problem from multiple dimensions and welcoming solutions from a multidisciplinary perspective.
I'm very interested in also this odd time in American history where that is so full of thoughtfulness around issues of race and inclusion, and particularly in museums, which have not been the most inclusive and embracing of institutions. You hold a very interesting position. You are a Canadian of South Asian descent. You come as an insider outsider to both the United States and the management of these institutions. You are an artist and designer. Could you talk a little bit about your feelings about what's going on in terms of the world's reckoning with racism, the idea of racial disparities, and how museums should function in a way that that ease the interactions and bring society into a more egalitarian, embracing, sort of dialoguing communication amongst people with different views?
No, this is a serious issue that requires not just a knee-jerk, short-term solution, but requires some thinking and some steps at various levels. So you do see that there is a lack of racial diversity at our cultural institutions. They tend to be monocultural, and there is some degree of tokenism at the mid-level or lower-level managements or lower-level staff. But the leadership, the diversity in leadership is still a challenge, both, of course, in Canada and in the United States and elsewhere. It is certainly not a black and white issue. It has other shades and other sort of tones and connotations that have a bigger issue surrounding it. And in some ways, when you look at post-colonial societies, there are some chapters in that history that are not pleasant. And the classic dialogue of how much of history to preserve and how much to destroy, and who gets to do the curation on that is sort of an eternally debatable platform. But that being said, having diversity at museum studies programs, in the faculty, at the student levels, and the awareness with recruitment firms when they seek diversity for the right reasons, education of that platform which eventually picks and chooses leadership for cultural institutions of tomorrow. I think there's a shared responsibility between educational institutions, executive recruiters, institutions, and board diversity. They all need to have a shared perspective on what is effective and what has not worked in the past, and kind of look beyond color and also look beyond some immediate challenges to see what might work to strengthen the fabric of multicultural societies. There is a poet I quite often remember and quote, Derek Walcott, the poet laureate. And Derek had mentioned in one of his famous poems, The Schooner, that I come from a land where the sun, tired of the empire, sets in the west, and setting so gives birth to 1,000 stars. I have the love of sea in me. I had a good English education, but I had the love of sea in me. I had a little bit of Dutch, nigger, and English in me. I can roll up the sleeves of my shirt and bear the white scars on my brown skin. Either I'm a nation or I'm a nobody.
In terms of your work, one of the things that in closing I'll bring you back to is this whole idea of shaping institutions for the audience experience, and for a very inclusive audience experience. I think perhaps when you start to think about museums not from the point of view of the experts who have always stewarded them, and wonderful experts who have always stewarded them, but now to think of museums from the perspective of the people who must attend and experience and enjoy them, you end up with a totally different view of what competencies come into play when it comes to management, don't you?
Yes, And like I mentioned before, it's time for museums to rethink their models, not just monetization models, but also the qualitative models. This generation, the generation alpha that is coming up, the generation of screenagers, they think, behave, act, and engage with technology very differently. And their levels of, their attention span to their ability to surf the net and see curated information is on a different level. It's a generational shift. It's a paradigm shift. And that perspective needs to be brought in with professionals who can think 2 steps ahead so that content can be designed to resonate with that audience. Otherwise, they will lose that audience. Just the evolution of social media platforms from Facebook to TikTok to whatever else is lurking the horizon. Those are reality checks for museum professionals in the way they want to in the way they want to be useful and to engage the diverse audiences, especially the new generation. So I released a book a few months ago called Gen Alpha, Museum Futures. And then last week I released a second book, which is called The Corona Conundrum. And that addresses, what Corona has done in the last 16 weeks to give a reality check and, bring some urgency to the table in terms of how to rethink, like I said, the way museums monetize themselves and their content, but also how the exhibit experiences can be collaboratively shared and curated across conventional boundaries.
Well, George, we'll let that be the last word. It's a wonderful point. Attendees, thank you very much for coming and visiting. That's the Nonprofit Report. George, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights with us. And let's keep up this work to strengthen civil society.